3 years ago, I sat in my father's SUV as we drove the 300 miles to my mother's parents' home in Midland, Texas. We had been driving for about 3 hours and stopped twice, once to use the bathroom and once to eat some lunch. Meanwhile, I had been listening to music as my only form of entertainment the entire trip. I shifted between staring out of the window at the progressively changing landscape and tipping my head back against the headrest to doze. As I observed the green grass turn yellow, the woodlands disperse into rocky, cow-infested prairies, and the mesas come and gone with its windmills perched on its red cliffs, I was thinking about how this semi-annual visit would be different this time. I pondered how I acted around my grandparents, my uncle, and my cousins during all the other visits. Every year since I turned 10, my grandparents had stopped playing board games with my sister and I as it was dull for them, and both of us had our devices to play with. For a few years, the two of us agreed that these visits had become boring. When we visited, my grandparents only watched reruns of old sitcoms from the 50s, talked about politics and work, cooked delicious meals such as prime rib, spaghetti, and chicken and dressing, and gathered around the table to play a game of 42 with a box of dominoes. Instead of joining in with any of these activities, I opted to play on my phone, my Nintendo DS, and my iPad, while occasionally leaving the guest room to eat and to play with their elderly Boston Terrier, Izzy, and their white cat with pale ginger stripes, Sheldon. Going outside wasn't much of an option to me because of how hot it usually was, and because the dead grass in the backyard and the field hid a minefield of stickers. Therefore, I preferred to stay inside rather than spend 15 minutes picking sticker thorns out of the treads of my tennis shoes. Whenever my grandparents got their dominoes out, I always rolled my eyes because the game looked so boring, and as soon as they would start playing, they had no plan to stop until a good 4 hours had passed. Not only that, but 4 hours of nothing except the sound of clacking dominoes became very tiresome to listen to. If I wanted anything while they played, I had to get help from my mother, who was also disinterested in their game. After another 2 hours of driving, my gaze was fixed on a small one-story house planted in a dusty field with tall dried grass and a dirt driveway. My grandparents were there to greet us on the porch while we clambered out of the car and gathered our luggage together. I hugged them and thought about how this trip would be different than the rest. That weekend, I did my best to stay disconnected from my phone so that I would not waste any more opportunities to spend time with my 70-year-old grandparents. As all of the adults talked at the table while we ate my grandma's chicken and dressing, I took in what they talked about instead of tuning out their charming small-town accents in favor of smelling the sage, oregano, and celery aromas from the kitchen. I never joined in with the conversation as I sensed that I didn't know enough about the subject to contribute, but I could tell that my grandparents were surprised by my silent presence at the dinner table. Finally, it was time to see what 42 was all about. It had to be fun since my grandparents, my father, and my uncle and cousins would always take turns jumping into one of the four seats to play for an hour or two. I approached the worn-out blue padded folding table covered in a pile of upside-down white dominoes and asked my grandmother if I could play. She broke out into a smile that allowed me to take her seat, where she then dragged a wooden chair from the dining room over to sit next to me. She coached me the whole time, helping me pick out which dominoes would be good to play, in which order, and why. I was fascinated. I had never imagined that this game required so much strategy and teamwork. From afar, it only looked like a group of adults hunched over their sets of dominoes which were haphazardly thrown out into the middle, when, really, the game was so much more. I had to keep track of what had already been played, which number was a trump for each round, and whether I could support my partner if I lacked a good hand. I can't say that I'm proficient or that I understand the details of the strategy of 42 at all, but I can say that I enjoyed myself as I slowly figured out how to interpret my hand. Now, every time I visit their house, I get excited when I hear dominoes clacking around in their little box, and I jump to my feet to help set up the folding table and the folding chairs. Ever since that weekend when I was 15, I have happily plopped myself down into one of the old blue folding chairs to play a few games of 42 with my grandparents, my father, and my uncle and cousins while my grandmother coaches me. I will never regret convincing myself to spend what little time I do have with my faraway grandparents, building a bond that I didn't have with them prior.